In a small white house in the lush suburbs of Willowbrook, Pennsylvania, the Bennett family was living peacefully, at least on the surface. Laura Bennett worked as a children's book editor at a local publishing house. Her husband, James, was an accountant, a reliable man with a good sense of balance. They had an 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, a lively girl with dark hair and sparkling blue eyes, who was the youngest member of the reading club at school. "Sophie, the school bus is here," Laura called from the kitchen. She smiled as she slipped a small note into Sophie's lunchbox. It read, "Have a wonderful day. I love you from Mom." Sophie came rushing down the stairs. "Mom, the library is getting new books today." "That's nice, dear." "We'll stop by on our way home," Laura said, kissing the top of her daughter's head. She thought Sophie's intellectual curiosity resembled her own. Laura treasured these happy, everyday moments because her own childhood had been so very different. In the home where Laura grew up, there were no expressions of love or words of encouragement. Her mother, Margaret, had been a cold and critical woman since Laura was small. "You never do anything right, and you need to do better" were everyday phrases. Sometimes Laura would be denied food and locked in the basement. Meanwhile, Laura's sister, Rachel, was clearly her mother's favorite. Whatever Rachel did was creative or clever. If Laura did the same thing, she was scolded for doing it wrong or getting in the way. This unfair treatment created a deep divide between the sisters. Even now, Rachel lived in the same town as their mother and saw her several times a week. Even now, whatever mother said was absolute. After meeting James, getting married, and having Sophie, Laura had kept her relationship with her family to a minimum, just phone calls and visits for birthdays, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, the bare necessities. Still, whenever she heard her mother's critical words or saw Rachel's smug face, the trauma of her childhood would resurface. "Are you all right?" James entered the kitchen with a coffee in hand. He hadn't missed the cloud that passed over Laura's face. "Yes, just thinking," Laura smiled. James knew about her past, and he knew what a strong woman she was. "Do you know some people earn over $10,000 a month just by posting Reddit stories on YouTube? No face, no voice, just a laptop. I do it too, late below, if you're curious." "I might be late today. I have a meeting with a client," James said. "All right, we'll stop by the library and then get dinner ready." That afternoon, Laura received a call at work. James had been in an accident at work and was taken to the hospital. He had fallen from scaffolding and hit his head hard. Laura rushed to the hospital. "He has regained consciousness, but we need to keep him under observation for a few days," the doctor explained. "I also recommend someone stay with him for the first few days. There's a possibility of unexpected complications after a head injury." Laura nodded. James woke up in the hospital bed and weakly smiled at her. "Sophie?" he asked. "She's at school. I'll go pick her up soon." Laura squeezed her husband's hand. The problem was who would look after Sophie. Laura needed to stay with James, and the after-school program Sophie usually attended didn't offer full day care. All of Laura's friends worked and couldn't suddenly take a child for several days. There was no other option. With trembling hands, Laura picked up the phone and dialed Margaret's number. "Mother, I have a favor to ask," Laura explained the situation. "Yes, of course. I'll take Sophie," Margaret answered, surprisingly readily. "Rachel will help too. She's on vacation now." Laura felt sick to her stomach, but she had no choice. "Thank you. I'll bring Sophie over in the morning." That evening, Laura explained the situation to Sophie. "Daddy isn't feeling well. I need to take care of him. So you'll be staying with Grandma and Aunt Rachel for a few days." Sophie's eyes widened anxiously. "But Grandma's house is scary." Laura's heart ached. Sophie had instinctively sensed the atmosphere in Margaret's home. "You'll be fine. I'll come get you soon, and if anything happens, call me right away." The next morning, Laura drove Sophie to Margaret's house. The old two-story house was the setting of Laura's nightmares. The door opened, and Margaret appeared. Her graying hair was perfectly styled, and she was elegantly dressed. From the outside, she looked like a warm grandmother. "Sophie, I'm so glad you're coming to Grandma's." Margaret smiled, but her eyes were cold and calculating. Laura hugged Sophie tightly. "I'll call you soon. If anything happens, contact me anytime." Back in the car, Laura gripped the steering wheel. Warning bells were ringing in her chest, but James needed her presence. Taking a deep breath, Laura drove to the hospital. Under the fluorescent lights of the hospital, Laura held James's hand while staring at her cell phone. 6 hours had passed since she'd left Sophie. It was 3:00 when school ended. Laura dialed Margaret's number. "Hello, Mother. Has Sophie come back from school?" "Yes," Rachel picked her up. "She's having a snack now." Margaret's voice had an unnaturally cheerful tone. "Can I talk to Sophie?" After a brief pause, Sophie's small voice came through. "Mom, honey, are you all right? How's Grandma's house?" "Yes, I'm fine." Sophie's voice was smaller than usual, as if she was hiding something. There was a noise in the background, and Margaret quickly took the phone. "She's really being a good girl, Laura. Don't worry. How is James doing?" Laura frowned. Sophie seemed like she wanted to say more. "James is stable. We need to keep an eye on him a bit longer, but, well, that's good. Talk to you tomorrow." Margaret ended the conversation. Laura tried to focus on taking care of James despite her worries. The next day followed the same pattern. When Laura called, her conversations with Sophie were always brief, with Margaret or Rachel quickly taking the phone. Sophie's voice lacked energy, and Laura's concern grew. "I don't think she's being honest," Laura confided to James on the third night. "Her voice sounds different. Something must have happened." James sat up in bed and took Laura's hand. "I think so too, but it looks like I can be discharged tomorrow. So let's go pick up Sophie together." The next morning, the doctor approved James's discharge. "If you experience headaches or nausea, come back immediately and take it easy for the next few days." Laura breathed a sigh of relief. Now they could finally get Sophie back. She helped James into the car and left the hospital. That's when she decided to call Sophie. "Hello, may I speak to Sophie?" Laura asked. "Oh, Laura," it was Margaret's voice. "Sophie is out shopping with Rachel right now." Laura frowned. "But shouldn't she be in school?" "Oh, she wasn't feeling well today, so we let her stay home." "Don't worry, it's just a slight cold." Laura's heart raced. "Why didn't you call me? I knew you were busy." Margaret's voice was smooth. "Besides, it's really just a minor cold. She doesn't even have a fever. James has been discharged, so we're coming to pick up Sophie now," Laura said. "You should probably wait until tomorrow." Margaret's voice suddenly became stern. "James needs rest. Besides, Sophie is enjoying herself here. You can leave her a little longer." Laura felt anger rising. "No, we're coming today. We'll be there in 2 hours." After hanging up, Laura explained the situation to James. His face looked worried too. "Let's go straight there," James said. "Something doesn't seem right." They arrived at Margaret's house at 2:00 in the afternoon. Surprisingly, the house was completely quiet. There was no response to the doorbell or knocking. "Let's look through the windows," James suggested. When Laura peered through the living room window, the room was perfectly tidy, but there was no sign of anyone. "They must be out," she said. "They went shopping," Laura remembered, but she didn't say when they'd be back. They waited an hour, 2 hours. As the day began to fade, anxiety turned to fear. Laura called Margaret's and Rachel's cell phones repeatedly, but both went straight to voicemail. "We should contact the police," Laura said. At the local police station, they explained the situation to a young officer. He listened sympathetically but eventually shook his head. "I'm sorry, but it hasn't been 48 hours since your daughter went missing. And if she's with her grandmother—" "But no one's at home," Laura cried. "My mother and sister aren't answering their phones, and they said my daughter was sick." "I understand how you feel," the officer said, "but legally we can't start a search right away, especially when the child is believed to be with family members." Laura and James headed to a hotel, disheartened. They decided to spend the night near Margaret's house and check again tomorrow. "I'm really worried," Laura said as she lay in bed. When I think about what my mother might be doing to Sophie, James hugged his wife. Let's go to the house again in the morning. If no one is there, we'll contact a lawyer and formally file a missing person report. That night, Laura couldn't sleep at all. Terrible memories from her childhood came flooding back the darkness of the basement. Hunger, loneliness, and above all, the feeling of despair when no one heard her cries for help. Please don't do the same to Sophie, Laura whispered in the darkness. At 5:00 in the morning, Laura woke up actually. She had never really slept. James was already up and making coffee. They prepared quickly without exchanging words. On the way to Margaret's house, Laura's cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello, this is Laura Bennett. Mrs. Bennett, this is Detective Johnson from the Willowbrook Police Department. The male voice was tense. I'm calling about your daughter, Sophie Bennett. Laura's blood ran cold. What happened to Sophie? Your daughter was found collapsed behind the garbage disposal area on Cedar Street this morning. She was conscious but severely weakened. She's currently being transported to City Hospital, Laura screamed. James quickly pulled the car over to the shoulder and took the phone. While he was talking to the police, Laura dialed her mother's number with trembling hands. Mother, what happened to Sophie? The police called me. Margaret's voice was surprisingly calm. There was even a hint of amusement. Oh, really? She must have gone out on her own. She was in bed last night. Laura was speechless. Next, she called her sister. Rachel, Sophie was found at a garbage dump. What happened? I just told her to go outside. Rachel's voice sounded cold. She was being noisy. That's all I know. Laura hung up and turned to James. His face was distorted with anger and fear. Let's hurry to the hospital, he said. Laura nodded, and in her heart she made a decision. This would end here. She would never let her mother and sister near them again, and she would make them take responsibility. Laura and James ran desperately down the white corridors of City Hospital on their way to the pediatric intensive care unit they had been directed to. Laura's mind was filled with horrifying images. What condition was Sophie found in? What had happened at the garbage disposal site? And, most of all, why had her mother and Rachel responded so callously? Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, a middle-aged female doctor in a white coat, approached. I'm Dr. Morris, your daughter's attending physician. Is Sophie all right? Laura's voice trembled. First, her life is not in danger, the doctor said in a calm voice. However, she is quite weakened. She shows signs of dehydration, hypothermia, and has bruises all over her body. James squeezed Laura's shoulder tightly. His face had hardened with anger. How long do you think she was outside? James asked. Judging from her body temperature and state of dehydration, she was likely outside for at least one night. Doctor, Morris paused momentarily. There are other concerns. Sophie's body also shows older scars. These indicate the possibility of abuse over multiple days, not just the recent few days. Laura gasped. The worst situation she had imagined had become reality. Can we see Sophie? She asked. Of course. Just be aware that she's still in a very weak state, and the police are also waiting to take a statement. But considering your daughter's condition, they've agreed to keep it brief. Guided by Dr. Morris, Laura and James entered Sophie's room. On the small bed, Sophie looked so tiny and frail. Anne, the fourth, was connected to her arm, and monitors displayed her heartbeat regularly. Her face had blue-purple bruises, and her arms were wrapped in bandages. Mommy, Sophie opened her eyes and called out in a faint voice. Laura rushed over and carefully took her daughter's hand. It's okay. You're safe now. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. I'm sorry. I was a bad girl. No, Laura immediately denied it. You did nothing wrong. Can you tell me what happened? Sophie was silent for a while. Then little by little, she began to tell the terrible truth. The day I arrived at Grandma's house was okay, but the next day when I was doing my homework, Aunt Rachel said I was too noisy. I had only dropped a pencil. James gently squeezed his daughter's other hand. Go on. It's okay. Then Grandma said, "This is how we disciplined your mom when she was little and locked me in the basement." Sophie's voice grew smaller. It was dark and cold. I was scared. Laura's heart ached. The fear she had experienced was now being inflicted on her daughter. "They didn't give me food, just a little water," Sophie continued. "They told me to be quiet, but when I cried to be let out, Grandma got angry." Sophie broke off and trembled. Laura wanted desperately to hug her daughter, but was afraid of aggravating her injuries. "Last night," Aunt Rachel said, "go outside and open the door. It was dark and cold outside, but I thought it was better than the basement." Then I don't remember. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Laura and James were speechless. The doctor knocked softly and entered. "I think that's enough, doctor," Morris said. "Sophie needs rest." She pointed to a uniformed officer in the hallway. "Detective Johnson would like to speak with you." Before standing up, Laura gently kissed Sophie's forehead. "I'll be right back. I won't leave you alone again." In the hallway, Detective Johnson was waiting with a notepad. He was a man in his mid-40s with experienced eyes. "Mrs. Bennett, I've heard from your daughter," he said, "and I've received the hospital's report. This is clearly a case of child abuse. We're ready to request arrest warrants for your mother and sister." Laura nodded. "Please punish them. I'll testify too." Detective Johnson looked at her intently. "Have you experienced something similar?" Laura took a deep breath. This was a secret she had never publicly shared. But now, for Sophie's sake and for her own healing, it was time to tell the truth. "Yes, as a child, I suffered the same kind of abuse from my mother: confinement in the basement, denial of food. I was always called the problem child. Meanwhile, my sister Rachel was mother's favorite." Detective Johnson nodded while taking notes. "This will be important testimony. Your past experiences will corroborate this case. I've also contacted Child Welfare Services. Dr. Morris added, "Their representative will arrive shortly. An assessment of Sophie's condition and environment is necessary. I failed to protect my daughter," Laura's voice choked. "I should have protected her from my childhood trauma. Don't blame yourself." James took his wife's hand. "We did our best. What's important now is keeping Sophie safe and helping her recover." "You're right," Laura raised her face. There was a new determination in her eyes. "And I'll make sure my mother and Rachel take responsibility so they never hurt anyone again." "The first step is to apply for a protection order," Detective Johnson said. "This will legally protect your daughter from any contact with the Hudsons. Next, we'll proceed with formal criminal charges." Laura nodded beside James. The fear and anger she had suppressed for years had now transformed into strength to protect her daughter. "Have you contacted a lawyer?" Detective Johnson asked. "Yes, on our way to the hospital," James answered. "She'll be here soon, Kate Branson, a lawyer specializing in child abuse cases." "Good choice," the detective nodded. "I'll return to arrange the arrests. If there's any new information, I'll contact you immediately." As the detective left, Laura leaned on James. Fatigue and tension suddenly overwhelmed her. "We need to protect our little family," Laura said with determination. "We will," James promised. "And your mother and Rachel will face legal consequences." Through the window of the room, they could see Sophie's small, sleeping face. There were traces of tears on her cheeks, but now she was sleeping peacefully. The old-fashioned building of the Mercer County Courthouse in Pennsylvania exuded dignity with its imposing stone exterior. 3 months after the incident, Laura was climbing the courthouse steps, supported by James's arm. Sophie was at school. They had deliberately arranged for Sophie not to testify in court. They didn't want to deepen the wounds in her young heart. "Ready?" James squeezed Laura's hand. Laura took a deep breath. "Yes, this is what I've been waiting for." When they entered the courtroom, many people had already gathered. Local newspaper reporters had also come to cover this shocking child abuse case. At the prosecution table sat State Attorney Sarah Williams, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who was highly regarded for prosecuting child abuse cases. And at the defense table, Margaret and Rachel sat surrounded by lawyers. Both looked quite tired after 3 months in detention, but there was still arrogance in Margaret's eyes. She gave Laura and James a cold look as they entered. "All rise," the clerk announced as Judge Martin entered. He was a man in his mid-60s with a stern expression. "The case of the state of Pennsylvania versus Margaret Hudson and Rachel Hudson is now in session," the judge declared. "They are charged with child abuse, endangering a minor by placing them in a dangerous environment, and causing physical harm." The prosecution's opening statement began. Sarah Williams stood up and faced the jury. "Respected members of the jury, this case is not merely a family dispute. This is a deliberate and intentional abuse of an 8-year-old child. As the evidence will show, the defendants locked Sophie Bennett in a basement, denied her food, and ultimately forced her outside on a cold night. Her body clearly shows traces of abuse, and more tragically, this is part of a pattern of abuse that has continued across generations." Williams looked toward Laura. "As a witness, you will hear testimony from Laura Bennett, the victim's mother, who experienced similar abuse during her own childhood. She has bravely stood up to break this cycle of abuse." The defense attorney, Richard Cohen, stood up. He was known for his high legal fees. "Members of the jury, this case is not as simple as the prosecution claims. My clients were merely disciplining the child. Do not confuse cultural differences and generational differences in disciplinary methods with abuse. Also, please remember that Laura Bennett's testimony may be based on bias from years of family conflict." The courtroom was filled with tension as the first witness, Dr. Morris, who had examined Sophie, was called. She professionally explained the details of Sophie's injuries and why they were consistent with abuse. Photos were submitted as evidence, and the jurors frowned as they saw the bruises and scars on the small body. Next, child psychologist Jennifer Clark was called. Based on her interviews with Sophie, she testified about the trauma the child had experienced. Sophie shows typical symptoms of an abused child: fear, self-blame, and loss of trust. Particularly noteworthy is that she describes herself as a bad girl and believes she deserves punishment. This is a concept instilled by abusers. The defense cross-examination was fierce. Attorney Cohen attacked Clark's qualifications and methodology, trying to question the reliability of her testimony. However, Clark responded calmly and did not waver in her professional judgment. Then came the turn of the most important witness. The prosecution called Laura Bennett. Laura walked slowly to the witness stand and took the oath with her hand on the Bible. She avoided looking directly at Margaret and Rachel. "Miss S. Bennett, please tell us how you came to leave Sophie with your mother and sister," Prosecutor Williams asked. Laura explained about her husband's accident and hospitalization, and that she had no other options. She testified about her anxiety when leaving Sophie and her growing concern each day. "And please tell us about when you received the call from the police." With a trembling voice, Laura described in detail the phone call from the police and the subsequent situation at the hospital. The courtroom was silent. Then Prosecutor Williams asked the most difficult question. "Can you tell us about your own childhood?" Laura took a deep breath. This was a secret she had never shared in public. James nodded encouragingly from the front row. "When I was 5 years old," Laura began quietly, "my mother started locking me in the basement for minor things, not putting away toys, being a little noisy. I was locked in the dark, cold basement all night, sometimes for days. I was often denied food," she continued. "My mother constantly told me, 'You are worthless and you need to do better.' Meanwhile, my sister Rachel was praised for whatever she did. She was mother's favorite, and I was always the problem child." The courtroom was silent, and many people had tears in their eyes. Margaret sat with a hardened face, looking straight ahead, but surprisingly, Rachel covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders were shaking. "I swore not to inflict the same suffering on my daughter, but I failed to protect her from danger." Laura's voice choked. "I love Sophie. I'll do anything to protect her. The defense cross-examination was merciless. Attorney Cohen questioned the accuracy of Laura's memory and claimed her testimony was emotional and exaggerated. However, Laura remained unshaken and continued to state the facts calmly. As the final witness, a social worker from Child Welfare Services was called to testify about Sophie's current condition and recovery progress. Sophie is receiving specialized counseling and is gradually recovering. However, complete recovery from such trauma takes time. After the witness examinations ended, it was time for closing arguments. Prosecutor Williams passionately addressed the jury. This case is not just a single incident. This is a cycle of abuse across generations. Laura Bennett has bravely rescued her daughter from that cycle. Now we have a duty to show justice and hold the defendants accountable. Abuse is never discipline, it is a crime. Attorney Cohen also made his closing argument, but it seemed difficult to counter the weight of evidence. The jury retired to deliberate. Laura and James waited with tense expressions. 2 hours later, the jury returned. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. Yes, the jury foreman stood up. For the defendants Margaret Hudson and Rachel Hudson, we find them guilty on all counts, unanimously. Laura buried her face in James's shoulder and cried quietly. These were not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, finally released from years of burden. The judge granted a week's grace for sentencing, but both defendants were denied bail and returned to detention. As the court adjourned, Rachel looked at Laura for a moment. There was an emotion in her eyes that Laura had never seen before. A year after the trial, the Bennett family had begun a new life. Laura gazed out the window, watching Sophie playing in the garden. Sophie was smiling as she played tag with neighborhood girls. After the incident, she had stopped smiling for a while, but now she was gradually regaining her former brightness. She's really getting better. James stood beside Laura with a coffee in hand. Yes, the counselor, Lisa said. Sophie has remarkable resilience, Laura smiled. The twice-weekly therapy seems to be working. They had decided to move to a new town for a fresh start. James had transferred to a local accounting firm, and Laura continued her editing work remotely while starting to work on child abuse prevention in her spare time. It was work that utilized her own experiences, such as speaking at local support groups and counseling victim families. Ready for today's lecture? James asked. Yes, I'm a bit nervous. Laura took a deep breath. But if my story can help someone... Laura's lectures had become well known in the area. Her talk, titled Breaking the Chain of Generational Wounds, was touching many people's hearts. Her honesty and strength were giving hope to those in similar situations. Sophie had changed too. For the first few months, she was troubled by nightmares and feared unfamiliar adults. But supported by professional help and her parents' love, she was healing bit by bit. She had made friends at school and was enjoying reading books again. Meanwhile, Margaret and Rachel were serving their sentences in separate prisons. The judge had sentenced Margaret to 10 years and Rachel to 8 years of actual imprisonment to break the chain of abuse across generations. A letter had arrived from Rachel 6 months ago. It contained brief words of apology and mentioned that she was participating in a counseling program in prison. Laura had not yet written back. She felt that forgiveness and resuming a relationship were separate issues. There had been no contact from Margaret. "Mom, look!" Sophie called from the garden. She had a small butterfly resting on her palm. The butterfly rested its wings and eventually flew up into the sky. Laura smiled. It seemed like an image of herself. For a long time, she had been trapped in the cocoon of abuse trauma, but finally, she was free and taking flight. That night, after putting Sophie to bed, Laura took out her diary. It was a record of their journey. She picked up her pen and began writing on a new page. "I can now say with confidence that a true family is not about blood ties, but about protecting, respecting, and loving each other. When I look at Sophie, I feel hope. She will not have the kind of childhood I experienced. The chain of abuse across generations has ended here. Outside the window, the full moon shone quietly, as if announcing the beginning of a new day, a new life.